"Officer, you're about to make a mistake you can't undo." The words were calm, almost quiet, but in the middle of Terminal B at Reagan National Airport, they seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Travelers slowed their steps. A rolling suitcase rattled across polished tile and then faded into the background hum of announcements and jet engines outside the glass. Officer Daniel Briggs didn't slow down. His boots stopped directly in front of the tall man, standing near Gate 23, the man wearing a perfectly pressed navy dress blue uniform that caught the overhead lights like midnight glass. The uniform looked immaculate, every ribbon aligned, every button reflecting the bright terminal ceiling, the American flag patch resting still against the man's sleeve. His name tag read Carter. Marcus Carter stood quietly with one hand resting on the handle of a small carry-on bag, the kind built for short flights and tight overhead bins. Around him the airport moved in its usual rhythm. A family arguing gently over boarding groups, a businessman pacing while reading an email on his phone, a child staring wide-eyed at airplanes taxiing outside the window. Yet something about the scene between the officer and the man in uniform pulled attention the way thunder pulls eyes to the sky. Briggs folded his arms, his expression tight with suspicion. "Uniform like that gets attention," he said, voice firm enough that several nearby passengers turned their heads, especially when someone's trying a little too hard to wear it. Marcus didn't react the way people expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he looked directly at the officer with a steady calm that seemed oddly out of place in a busy airport terminal. The brass eagle on his chest caught the light as he shifted slightly. "I'm waiting for my flight to Norfolk," he said simply. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone used to speaking clearly in noisy rooms. Briggs stepped closer, studying the uniform again. The ribbons, the insignia, the sharp lines of the jacket. To him it didn't signal honor or service, it triggered suspicion. Airports had rules, and authority often began with doubt. "People pretend to be things they're not," Briggs replied. "Happens more than you'd think." A few travelers slowed their pace now, curiosity replacing distraction. Phones appeared in hands, not yet raised but ready. One elderly man wearing a veteran's cap paused beside a pillar, eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus's uniform with the quiet recognition only experience could bring. Marcus kept his posture straight. The overhead announcement crackled. "Flight 417 to Norfolk, now boarding Group 1. No one near Gate 23 moved. The moment had quietly taken over the space. Briggs gestured toward the uniform. "Mind explaining it?" he asked, tone still controlled but edged with challenge. Marcus glanced briefly toward the gate screen, then back to the officer. "Officer," he said again, measured and calm. "I'm just trying to catch my flight." The response only deepened Briggs's certainty that something didn't add up. Authority thrives on certainty, and Briggs had spent 6 years believing he could read people within seconds. To him the quiet composure looked rehearsed. To the growing crowd around them, it looked like patience. A young boy standing beside his mother tugged her sleeve and whispered, just loud enough for a few people nearby to hear, "Mom, that's a Navy uniform." She nodded slowly but didn't answer. Across the terminal windows, sunlight spilled across the runway, reflecting off aircraft wings and casting long streaks of gold across the floor tiles. In the reflection on the glass wall, Marcus could see the small audience forming behind him, travelers pretending not to stare but watching every movement. Briggs took one more step closer, now fully convinced he needed to take control of the situation before it turned into something bigger. Marcus exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but the quiet patience of someone who understood exactly how moments like this could unfold. "Officer," he said one last time, voice steady enough that even the people several yards away heard it clearly. "You're about to make a mistake you can't undo." And for a brief second, before anyone realized how quickly the next few minutes would change everything, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Carter had learned long ago that silence could carry more strength than argument. The moment stretched beneath the bright airport lights as Officer Daniel Briggs studied him with the kind of confidence that comes from believing authority always leads to the truth. Around them the terminal continued moving, yet the movement felt slower now, like a current shifting direction. Marcus rested his hand lightly on the handle of his carry-on bag, the polished brass buttons. of his navy dress blue jacket catching reflections from the glass wall facing the runway. A distant aircraft engine roared softly outside, the sound vibrating through the terminal floor before fading into the steady rhythm of announcements echoing overhead. Marcus had been standing in that exact spot for nearly 20 minutes, long enough to watch 3 different flights board, long enough to notice the small patterns of airport life that most travelers ignored. A mother calming a restless toddler. A group of college students arguing over which boarding group they belonged to. A janitor pushing a quiet electric floor machine along the far side of the corridor. He had been watching all of it with the patient awareness that years of military service had built into him. Patience had become second nature. His flight to Norfolk was scheduled to leave in just under 15 minutes. From there he would drive 2 hours south, toward Virginia Beach. The trip had not been planned weeks in advance like most travel. It had come suddenly, the kind of call that arrived without warning and carried weight behind every word. One of his teammates from a deployment years earlier was being laid to rest the following morning at Arlington National Cemetery. Marcus had spent the previous night carefully pressing his uniform in a small hotel room not far from the Potomac River, making sure every ribbon sat perfectly aligned across his chest. Dress blues were not worn casually. They represented ceremonies, memorials, and moments that carried meaning beyond the individual wearing them. When Marcus stepped out of the hotel that morning, the early Washington air had been cool and clear, the kind of quiet morning that made the marble monuments across the river glow softly in the rising sun. He had taken a rideshare to the airport, arriving earlier than necessary, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. In his world, arriving late was not an option. The uniform he wore had followed him through years of service that most people never saw. Long nights aboard naval vessels drifting across dark oceans. Training missions before sunrise when the air tasted like salt and metal. Operations that required calm decisions under pressure. The ribbons across his chest told a story in silent color and metal, though Marcus had never been someone who explained them to strangers. To him, they were reminders of teammates, of responsibility, and of the quiet promise that every person in that line of work carried. Around the terminal, the small group of onlookers had grown slightly larger, curiosity drawing people closer without them realizing it. Some pretended to check their phones while glancing up between messages. Others leaned casually against pillars, watching the conversation between the officer and the man in uniform unfold with quiet interest. The elderly veteran near the pillar adjusted his cap slowly, his eyes moving across the details of Marcus's uniform the way someone reads a familiar language. Officer Briggs remained focused on his own conclusion. In his mind, situations were solved through authority and control, and he had already decided that the man standing in front of him did not belong in the role he appeared to represent. "You said you are heading to Norfolk," Briggs said again, his tone measured but firm. "That is what you told me." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." The response carried no hesitation. Briggs glanced toward the gate display screen as if the digital letters might confirm something hidden. "Traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Marcus kept his voice calm. The officer folded his arms again, scanning the uniform one more time, lingering briefly on the ribbons before returning his gaze to Marcus's face. Behind them, the boarding announcement repeated itself. Final call for passengers traveling to Norfolk. The line at the gate had begun to move forward slowly, yet many of those passengers were now watching instead of boarding. Marcus could feel the weight of those eyes without turning around. The moment felt suspended, like a quiet pause before something shifted. He had seen moments like this before in entirely different places. Moments when someone believed they understood a situation completely while standing only inches from the truth. Marcus remained still, shoulders straight, posture calm. The uniform rested naturally against him, as familiar as his own reflection in a mirror. Officer Briggs finally stepped slightly closer, his voice lowering just enough to signal the next move in his decision. "We are going to need to sort this out before you go anywhere," he said. And somewhere beyond the tall airport windows, a dark government sedan was already turning off the highway exit ramp leading toward the terminal entrance. Officer Daniel Briggs had already decided how the situation would end. The confidence in his posture made that clear. He shifted his weight slightly and reached for the small radio clipped to his shoulder, his eyes never leaving Marcus Carter. Around them, the quiet audience that had formed near Gate 23 grew a little larger as more passengers slowed their steps, curiosity drawing them closer without a single word being spoken. The bright digital gate display blinked again above the boarding door, repeating the final call for passengers traveling to Norfolk. Yet the line that had started forming only moments earlier now stood still as several travelers turned to watch the exchange unfold. Marcus remained calm, the polished navy blue fabric of his uniform catching the light each time someone passed in front of the tall terminal windows. The reflection of aircraft outside moved slowly across the glass wall, sunlight gliding over wings and engines like drifting water. Briggs spoke into the radio in a low voice, the words quiet but deliberate. "I need a supervisor over at Gate 23. Possible impersonation issue." The phrase caused a subtle ripple through the small group of people nearby. A young college student lowered her phone slightly and whispered something to the friend standing beside her. The elderly veteran near the pillar straightened his back and adjusted the brim of his cap, his eyes narrowing again as he studied the details of Marcus's uniform more carefully. Marcus heard the words clearly but did not react. The accusation had already been implied in the officer's tone from the beginning. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the gate counter where the airline attendant stood frozen with a boarding scanner in her hand, uncertain whether to continue calling passengers or wait for whatever was happening to resolve itself. Marcus understood that hesitation. Moments like this had a way of pulling attention away from everything else in the room. The officer stepped slightly closer again, lowering the radio. "You said you are heading to Norfolk for a funeral," Briggs continued, his tone measured as if repeating the detail would somehow expose a contradiction. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Who is the service for?" Briggs asked. Marcus paused for a brief moment, not because he needed time to think, but because the memory behind the answer carried weight. "A teammate," he replied quietly. The word teammate held more meaning than most people would recognize. It carried years of shared work, trust, and the kind of experiences that rarely appeared in headlines. Briggs studied Marcus again as though measuring the response against his own expectations. "And you expect me to believe you are an active Navy service member traveling alone in a dress uniform through a commercial terminal?" Marcus met the officer's eyes without irritation. "I am not asking you to believe anything, officer," he said evenly. "I am only trying to catch my flight." The calmness in his voice did not challenge authority, yet it seemed to unsettle the certainty Briggs had built around the situation. In his experience, people who were confronted by police usually reacted differently. They raised their voices, argued, or tried to explain themselves with hurried words. Marcus did none of those things. He simply stood there with the quiet patience of someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to remain silent. A few feet away, the young boy who had earlier recognized the uniform tugged again on his mother's sleeve. "Why are they stopping him?" he asked softly. His mother hesitated before answering. "I do not know," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Near the far side of the terminal, a transportation security supervisor began walking toward the gate area, responding to the radio call Briggs had made only moments earlier. The supervisor moved with the steady pace of someone used to dealing with small airport disruptions, though he slowed slightly as he approached the gathering crowd. From his position, he could already see the Navy uniform standing out clearly against the neutral colors of the terminal floor and seating. Marcus noticed the man approaching, but kept his attention forward. The overhead speakers announced once again that the Norfolk flight would be closing its boarding door in several minutes. The words echoed across the polished tile floor before fading into the constant murmur of conversation and rolling luggage wheels. Briggs folded his arms again, confident that his decision had already set the process in motion. "We will get this cleared up," he said firmly. Marcus gave a small nod, the kind someone offers when acknowledging a statement rather than agreeing with it. For a moment, neither man spoke. The terminal lights hummed faintly above them, and beyond the tall windows another aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate, its engines rising into a steady roar that vibrated through the glass and steel of the building. And somewhere, on the roadway outside the terminal entrance, the dark sedan that had turned off the highway only minutes earlier was now pulling quietly toward the airport security checkpoint, its tinted windows reflecting the bright afternoon sky. The transportation security supervisor reached the edge of the gathering crowd and slowed his pace, his eyes moving across the small circle of travelers before settling on the two men at its center. Airports taught people how to read situations quickly, and within seconds he understood that something unusual had pulled attention away from the normal rhythm of boarding announcements and rolling suitcases. Officer Daniel Briggs stood with the quiet authority of someone certain that the moment belonged to him. Marcus Carter stood several feet away, calm and still, his navy dress blue uniform sharply outlined beneath the bright terminal lights. The supervisor stepped forward. "Officer Briggs," he said evenly. "What is going on here?" Briggs gestured toward Marcus without hesitation. "Possible impersonation," he replied. "Uniform does not match the situation." The supervisor turned his gaze toward Marcus, taking in the details that had already caught the attention of several people nearby. The dark blue jacket, the carefully aligned ribbons, the silver trident insignia resting above the row of decorations. Anyone unfamiliar with military uniforms might see only decoration. Someone with experience noticed the precision. Marcus inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement as the supervisor approached. "Sir," the supervisor said politely, "would you mind explaining where you are traveling today?" Marcus answered with the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Norfolk, Virginia." "And the purpose of the trip?" Marcus paused for only a moment. "A funeral service tomorrow morning at Arlington National Cemetery." The supervisor nodded slowly, though he did not comment. Instead, he stepped slightly closer and studied the name tag stitched above the right pocket of Marcus's jacket. "Carter." His eyes shifted briefly to the insignia above the ribbons again. Briggs crossed his arms. "He claims he is a Navy service member," the officer added, "traveling in full-dress uniform through a commercial terminal. No documentation provided yet." The words hung in the air as the nearby passengers continued watching with quiet attention. The elderly veteran near the pillar leaned slightly forward now, as though trying to see the insignia more clearly from where he stood. Marcus reached calmly into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather wallet. He opened it slowly and held it forward. Inside was a military identification card and a folded travel order document. The supervisor accepted the identification carefully, his expression neutral as he examined it. For a few seconds the terminal seemed to grow quieter, as though the entire gate area was waiting for the result of a simple glance at a small piece of plastic. The supervisor's eyes moved across the card once, then again more slowly. His posture changed almost imperceptibly. He lifted his gaze toward Marcus and then toward Officer Briggs. "Officer," he said quietly, "this identification appears valid." Briggs did not immediately respond. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to view the card himself. The name Marcus Carter was printed clearly across the top. The photograph matched the man standing in front of them. The rank and service designation were listed beneath it. Still, Briggs hesitated. Authority often resists changing direction once it has committed to a path. "Anyone can carry a card," he said after a moment. "Verification still needs to happen." The supervisor returned the identification to Marcus with a polite nod. "Thank you, sir." Marcus slipped the card back into his jacket pocket without a word. The overhead announcement repeated again that the Norfolk flight would be closing its boarding door shortly. Several passengers shifted their weight uneasily, torn between their travel plans and the strange situation unfolding a few yards away. A woman near the boarding counter quietly lowered her phone after recording part of the exchange. Outside the tall terminal windows, the late afternoon sunlight had begun to soften, turning the edges of aircraft wings into long reflections of pale gold. In the distance, just beyond the security checkpoint road that curved toward the terminal entrance, the dark government sedan rolled slowly past the outer gate. Its tinted windows revealed nothing of the passengers inside. The vehicle moved with quiet purpose through the line of airport traffic, passing taxis and rideshare vehicles before turning toward the restricted parking area reserved for official use. Back inside, the terminal officer Briggs remained focused on Marcus, his certainty not yet shaken enough to reconsider his decision. "We are still verifying this," he said firmly. Marcus nodded once more, the calm expression on his face unchanged. The supervisor glanced briefly toward the terminal entrance, as if sensing movement somewhere beyond the glass walls, then returned his attention to the two men standing before him. The moment remained suspended in the bright airport light, balanced between authority and truth, with the sound of approaching footsteps echoing faintly down the polished corridor behind them. The dark sedan finally arrived at the terminal's restricted parking area, its tires humming softly against the smooth asphalt as it came to a stop. The vehicle was sleek, black, with dark tinted windows that concealed the occupants inside, the kind of car that blended into the background yet held an undeniable weight of authority. The sound of the car door opening was swallowed by the hum of airport noise, but the few people nearby looked up, recognizing the shift in atmosphere. The two men near gate 23 did not notice the vehicle's arrival, nor the tall figure that stepped out from it. Marcus Carter remained still, his posture as steady as it had been from the beginning. Officer Daniel Briggs, however, continued to scan the crowd, his arms folded across his chest, every muscle in his body betraying the certainty he felt in the unfolding situation. The supervisor glanced briefly toward the vehicle, then back to Marcus, a silent understanding passing between them. The air around them seemed to hold a breath, waiting for something to break the tension that had quietly settled like a fog. As the supervisor nodded, signaling that the paperwork was in order, there was a sudden shift, a subtle but undeniable change. "We need to make one more call," Briggs said, his voice firm, yet now carrying a faint hint of uncertainty. He reached for his radio again, but before he could speak, the sharp echo of footsteps across the terminal's polished floor interrupted him. Two men, both dressed in sharp suits and carrying the unmistakable air of high-level officials, approached the gate. Their movements were deliberate, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced ease. The taller of the two men, wearing dark sunglasses despite the fading afternoon light, walked with the confidence of someone used to making decisions that others would follow without question. The other man, slightly shorter but with an equally commanding presence, carried a folder under his arm, its contents clearly heavy with significance. They did not need to speak to make their intentions known. Briggs straightened immediately upon seeing them, his posture shifting from the solid stance of authority to one of reluctant respect. The taller man in the sunglasses spoke first, his voice low but firm. "What seems to be the issue here, officer?" His words were directed at Briggs, but his eyes never left Marcus. The supervisor nodded toward Marcus, his expression now acknowledging the weight of the situation. "This gentleman was stopped for questioning regarding his identity," the supervisor explained calmly. The man in sunglasses paused for a moment, his gaze moving from the officer to Marcus before landing on the identification card still tucked neatly into Marcus's jacket. He did not ask to see it again. "What is your name, sir?" he asked directly, his tone less formal, but no less authoritative. Marcus looked up and met the man's gaze without hesitation. "Marcus Carter," he said clearly, his voice unwavering. The man nodded slowly, as if processing the response, and glanced briefly toward the folder under his arm. There was no surprise, no shock, only a quiet understanding that passed between him and the other man beside him. "It appears we have some verification to do," the man in sunglasses said, more to himself than anyone else. He made a subtle gesture with his hand, and the other man stepped forward, pulling a small device from his jacket pocket. It was a handheld scanner, the kind used for security purposes, and he began to scan the air around Marcus, quietly confirming every detail of his identification. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed ahead, as though he had already anticipated this moment. The sound of the scanner humming softly in the quiet terminal seemed to stretch out, amplifying the tension that had already settled between the two men in the suits and the officer still standing at the edge of the scene. The crowd, now growing larger, had fallen silent, watching the exchange unfold with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Finally, after several long moments, the man in sunglasses spoke again. "Everything checks out," he said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. He turned toward Officer Briggs, the earlier tension now dissolved. "I believe the matter is resolved, officer." Briggs stiffened slightly but nodded, his eyes flicking to Marcus before returning to the men in suits. "Yes, sir," he replied curtly, his earlier certainty now replaced with the quiet resignation that came with being out of his depth. The man in sunglasses gave a small nod, his lips curling slightly in what could have been the faintest trace of a smile. "Thank you for your cooperation, officer," he said, his tone dismissive but not unfriendly. The two men in suits turned, and began walking toward the terminal exit, their purposeful strides signaling the end of the matter. Marcus watched them for a moment, his posture unchanged. He knew what was coming next. He could feel the weight of it in the air. The officials' footsteps faded into the distance as they moved toward the security checkpoint, their presence no longer necessary in the space where a simple misunderstanding had just been corrected. As the last of the suit-clad figures exited the terminal, Marcus turned his attention back to the gate. He could hear the faint buzz of an overhead announcement, a reminder that the flight to Norfolk would soon be closing. The line at the gate was moving again, as if the brief disruption had never happened at all. Officer Briggs remained standing near Gate 23, his arms still crossed, but now his eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort as the full weight of the situation began to settle on him. Marcus Carter, standing calmly in the uniform he had earned through years of service, was about to do nothing more than board his flight. His mission clear, his next step already set in motion. As the final announcement for Flight 417 echoed through the terminal, Marcus Carter stepped forward, his boots tapping softly against the polished floor. The soft hum of the overhead speakers faded into the background, but the quiet ripple of movement around him seemed to grow louder. The passengers, now back to their routines, continued boarding, each one a small part of the ongoing dance of an airport in motion. Officer Daniel Briggs stood still, arms still crossed, his eyes following Marcus's every step. The discomfort that had begun to settle in his chest remained, an unfamiliar sensation for someone used to maintaining control in every situation. He hadn't been wrong in his suspicion, but something about the way Marcus had carried himself had shifted his perception. The man in the navy dress blue uniform hadn't reacted the way others might have. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't tried to assert his position with anger or defiance. He had remained calm, the quiet dignity of someone who had lived a life of purpose. And now, as Marcus approached the gate, Briggs found himself uncertain of how to feel about the situation. He had done his job, followed procedure, but it hadn't played out the way he had expected. Marcus didn't glance back as he reached the gate counter, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his carry-on bag. The airline attendant, who had been watching the entire exchange, smiled politely and scanned his ticket. "Your flight is ready to board, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice warm, the brief hesitation in her tone betraying her own curiosity about what had just transpired. Marcus nodded, his expression unchanged, and stepped forward toward the boarding ramp. As he walked, his uniform caught the light once more, the dark blue fabric reflecting the soft glow of the terminal lights. He could hear the soft murmur of voices behind him, the whispers that always followed moments of confusion and uncertainty. He had been used to it for years. The life of a Navy SEAL was one of constant tension, where every mission was filled with unknowns. But this was different. He was not on duty now, not in a foreign country or on a classified mission. This was just a flight to Norfolk, a funeral for a friend. And yet, even in the midst of the most mundane moments, there was a weight to his presence, a reminder of the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the sacrifices he had made. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the cold air from the plane's air conditioning hit him briefly, a sharp contrast to the warm terminal. The sounds of the boarding process, the calls for final passengers to board, filled the air as the door to the aircraft closed behind him. He paused for a moment, his hand on the railing, and took a deep breath. There was a quiet moment of reflection as the jet bridge swayed gently beneath his feet, the faint rumble of the airplane engines just beginning to vibrate through the floor. He thought of his teammate, the one who had passed, the one whose funeral he was now heading to. The loss was fresh, the wound still raw, but the purpose of his journey had never been clearer. It wasn't just about honoring the man who had been his friend and brother in arms. It was about something more, a recognition that those who served, who gave their all, were often forgotten in the noise of everyday life. Marcus stepped onto the plane, finding his seat by the window, and settled in, his eyes briefly closing as he leaned back into the seat. He hadn't realized how much the weight of the day had worn on him until now, the events of the airport behind him and the quiet hum of the plane offering a small sense of relief. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their voices a soft murmur over the speakers. As the plane slowly began to taxi toward the runway, Marcus's eyes flicked open, his mind shifting back to the task at hand. There would be time for reflection later, but for now, there was only the flight ahead, the funeral, and the quiet duty that came with both. And in the distance, beyond the wings of the plane, the sky stretched out, an endless horizon waiting to be crossed. The small ripple of tension in the terminal was now far behind him. All that mattered now was the path forward. As the plane ascended into the sky, Marcus Carter gazed out of the window, the city of Washington, D.C. shrinking beneath him. The bright lights of the terminal he had just left flickered in the distance, now fading into the darkness of the night. It was a strange feeling to have left that chaotic moment behind him, yet still carry the weight of it. The quiet hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a steady sound that seemed to ground him as the world outside shifted slowly into a blanket of clouds. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, allowing the turbulence of the past few hours to slip away. The conversation with Officer Briggs, the uncertainty in the air, and the sudden intervention of those men in suits. All of it felt like a distant memory already. But that was the nature of his life. He had learned early on to compartmentalize, to leave each moment behind him when it was over, no matter how intense it had been. The military had taught him that. Focus on the mission. Focus on the task at hand. Everything else could wait. His mind wandered back to the task before him. The funeral was just hours away. He would be there, standing in the crowd, paying his respects to a fallen comrade. It was a simple, yet powerful duty. The kind of thing that held more meaning than anything else in his life. Marcus had lost many friends during his years of service. Each loss left a mark, a reminder of the fragility of life and the price of duty. But it was moments like this, moments of quiet reflection, that made him understand the importance of what he did. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something larger than himself. A team. A brotherhood. He felt that bond now more than ever. The seatbelt sign flashed on above him, and he pulled himself out of his thoughts, adjusting in his seat as the plane leveled off. The soft glow of the cabin lights cast gentle shadows across the faces of the other passengers. A few were already asleep, their heads resting against the headrests, while others stared absently at their screens. Marcus didn't mind the silence. It gave him time to think, to prepare for the next chapter in his journey. He had been trained to face challenges, to remain calm under pressure, but today had been different. The confrontation in the terminal, the suspicion, the doubt, it had all been unexpected. For a brief moment, he had wondered if things might escalate further, but now, with the distance of a few miles between him and the airport, he knew that it had all been a misunderstanding. He would carry on. That's what soldiers did. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the flight attendant as she passed down the aisle, offering drinks. He accepted a bottle of water, nodding politely as she moved on. The simple gesture of a familiar routine felt grounding. As the plane continued its journey south, Marcus allowed his mind to drift once more, but this time it was not to the events of the airport or to the funeral awaiting him. Instead, his thoughts turned to the future. He had given so much of his life to his country, to the service, but what came next? It was a question that had been on his mind for some time, one that didn't have a clear answer. For now, he would do what he had always done. He would focus on what was in front of him. The rest could wait. The soft sound of the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Norfolk. Marcus straightened in his seat, fastening his seatbelt as the airplane began to lower into the night sky. The clouds outside seemed to part, revealing the faint glow of city lights far below. Norfolk, a place he had known well during his time in the Navy. It felt like a different world now. The city he had left behind, the life he had lived, all felt distant now. But it was a part of him, just as much as the uniform he wore or the medals pinned to his chest. As the plane touched down, the tires hitting the runway with a soft thud, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him. He was here. This was where he needed to be. And whatever came next, he would face it with the same quiet strength he always had. The soft hum of the engine slowly faded as the plane touched down in Norfolk, the wheels connecting with the runway in a steady rhythm that brought a quiet sense of finality. Marcus Carter remained in his seat for a moment, the seatbelt lights still on above him, his eyes fixed on the small strip of city lights visible outside the window. Norfolk was a city he had known well during his time in the Navy, yet now, it felt distant, like another chapter of his life that had been left behind. He had seen this city many times, but never quite like this. The noise and movement of the airport below felt strangely muffled, as if he were still in the air, drifting above it all. He could feel the plane's engines winding down, the vibrations in the floor slowly coming to a stop as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. The flight attendants began to move down the aisles, collecting trash and preparing for disembarkation. Marcus remained in his seat, waiting for the final announcement, his mind far away. He wasn't thinking about the funeral that awaited him in the morning, nor the duty that had brought him to Norfolk. For the first time in what felt like years, his mind was clear, untouched by the usual noise of military orders or the chaos of airport terminals. He let out a slow breath, allowing the steady rhythm of the moment to ground him. The captain's voice echoed through the cabin, the announcement that they had arrived at their destination, the routine greeting that always accompanied the end of a flight. The seatbelt light clicked off, and Marcus stood up, stretching his legs as he grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment. As he stepped into the aisle, he glanced back once at the seat he had just vacated. It seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was a reminder of the time spent on the plane, the brief moments between destinations. The passengers around him gathered their things and began to move toward the exit. Marcus followed the flow of people, stepping off the plane and into the terminal, the familiar smell of coffee and airport food greeting him as he entered the bustling space. Norfolk's airport was quiet compared to others, but there was a sense of urgency in the air, the travelers moving with purpose. Marcus walked slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, his thoughts still a little distant. He had expected to feel a sense of finality once he arrived, but instead, there was a quiet unease that lingered. It wasn't just the funeral waiting for him the next day, but something else, something deeper, that he couldn't quite place. He moved toward the baggage claim area, where a few travelers stood waiting for their luggage to appear. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as he leaned against the wall, watching the conveyor belt begin to move. His mind drifted back to the events of the day, the confrontation at the airport, the tension in the terminal. It had all felt so out of place, but now, as he stood in the relative calm of Norfolk's small airport, it seemed almost trivial. There had been moments in his career that felt far more dangerous, far more uncertain. But today, something had shifted inside him. The events of the airport, the questioning, the waiting, it had all felt like a small test, one that had somehow caught him off guard. He could hear the faint sound of the intercom, announcing another flight, but it felt distant, like background noise to the thoughts running through his head. His bag finally appeared on the conveyor belt, and he grabbed it, walking toward the exit doors. The cool Norfolk air hit him immediately as he stepped outside, a welcome contrast to the sterile warmth of the terminal. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the air around him, heavy with the promise of the coming day. The world seemed to slow down as he stood there, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. He had arrived, but the journey wasn't over. Not yet. There was still much to do, still much to face. But for now, he would allow himself a moment of peace. The sound of tires against pavement broke his reverie as a car pulled up in front of the terminal. Marcus recognized the familiar face of the driver, an old friend from his Navy days, who waved at him as the door opened. Marcus nodded in return, lifting his bag as he moved toward the vehicle. As he climbed into the back seat, the door clicked shut behind him, and the car pulled away from the terminal, merging into the traffic of Norfolk. Marcus leaned back against the seat, his eyes closing for a moment as the car moved through the city streets. The quiet hum of the engine was a welcome sound, a reminder that, for now, the journey was over. The weight of the day lifted just a little as he looked out the window, the city lights blurring past him, each one a fleeting reminder of the path he had walked. Tomorrow would come soon enough. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the faintest sense of calm settle over him. He would face what was ahead, just as he always had. But for now, he would allow himself to rest. As the car rolled through the quiet streets of Norfolk, Marcus Carter leaned back against the plush seat, the soft hum of the engine filling the space around him. The rhythmic sound of tires on the road was oddly soothing, and for a moment, he allowed himself to let go of the tension that had clung to him for the past several hours. The city outside the window was a far cry from the bustling chaos of the airport, the calm suburban streets offering a rare moment of peace. It had been a long day, one full of unexpected turns and moments that left him questioning the way things worked. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules, kept his composure, but still, he had been treated with suspicion. It wasn't the first time, but each instance of being wrongly questioned always left a mark. And yet, despite it all, Marcus had moved forward, knowing that there was no other choice. The past was behind him, and the only thing that mattered now was the funeral awaiting him the next morning. He thought of his fallen comrade, the one whose life had been cut short in the line of duty. Tomorrow would be a somber day, but a necessary one. It was the way of things. People came together to honor the fallen, to remember the sacrifices made. The car turned onto a quieter street, and the driver glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "You good, sir?" he asked, his voice respectful but casual. Marcus nodded, offering a brief smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," he replied. The driver nodded in understanding, keeping his focus on the road ahead. It had been a while since Marcus had been back in Norfolk. His time here had been marked by long hours, demanding training, and the bonds forged with his fellow service members. It was a place that held both memories of triumph and loss, a city that had seen him at his best and at his worst. But now, as he returned for the funeral, the weight of those memories seemed distant, fading into the background like the city lights passing by the window. The car slowed as it approached a small hotel just outside the city center. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. Marcus had never been one to stay in lavish places. He preferred the simplicity of a clean, quiet room, a place where he could reflect and prepare for what was to come. As the car came to a stop, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. The city skyline loomed behind him, but there was no urgency in his steps. He moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if savoring the last few moments of solitude before the demands of the day ahead. Inside the hotel, the lobby was quiet, with only a few scattered guests moving in and out. Marcus approached the front desk, where a young woman looked up from her computer. "Checking in?" she asked with a polite smile. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice steady but calm. "Just for the night." She handed him a keycard without much fanfare, and he made his way to the elevator. The ride up was short, and as the doors opened to reveal the hallway, Marcus stepped out, moving toward his room. It was a modest space, but it was enough. He set his bag down on the bed and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to look out at the city below. Norfolk was a city that had seen its fair share of change, but there was something timeless about it. The water in the distance reflected the soft glow of the streetlights, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to think about the life he had lived, the places he had been, the people he had met, and the sacrifices he had made. It wasn't easy, this life. It never had been, but it was his. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, the responsibility of honoring the fallen. He turned away from the window and sat down on the bed, his thoughts drifting once again to the comrade he would be remembering. He thought of the last time they had spoken, the last mission they had completed together. There had been no warning, no time to prepare. One moment, his friend had been there, and the next, he was gone. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of loss and remembrance. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to push aside the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake him. It was hard, this part of life. Harder than any battle he had ever fought. But he would get through it, just as he always did. The night stretched on, quiet and still. Outside, the city continued to pulse with life, but inside, Marcus remained in his thoughts. Tomorrow would be a day of reflection, a day to honor the fallen, and a day to remember what truly mattered. But for tonight, there was only silence. And for once,